is a legislative update, which includes Joshua Boschee. He is a representative, was first elected to North Dakota House of Representatives in 2012 and reelected for his second term in November 2016. Josh spent most of the last year running to be North Dakota's 15th Secretary of State. In 2019, he was elected by his fellow caucus members to serve as the House Minority Leader. Representative Boucher's legislative focus has been on passing a fully inclusive statewide non-discrimination statute, increasing opportunities for North Dakota small businesses, and enhancing early childhood education and childcare services throughout the state, campaign finance reform, expanding access to local foods, and developing a statewide commitment to moving North Dakotans out of poverty. There's actually a lot more, but those are the main points. And then we have Tanya. We have Tanya, who works as the Director of Policy and Advocacy for ActionLink, the Center Action Network. Prior to joining CenterLink, Tanya worked for the Los Angeles LGBT Center, serving as Residential Services Coordinator at Triangle Square. And that's the nation's first and largest LGBTQ low-income senior housing facility. She was instrumental in developing and expanding their programming and advocacy services. She is the founder and director of the Los Angeles Senior Mobilization Squad, a group of older adult advocates who are dedicated to protecting and expanding the rights of the LGBTQ community. Welcome to both of you. I look so forward to this panel, so I'm going to hand it over.
Thank you. I think I'm going first, yes? Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. As she said, my name is Tanya Tassi. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for CenterLink, which is the community of LGBT centers. We have approximately 280 member centers throughout the country, including one right in your own state. And I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully everyone can see that. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about CenterLink. Our mission is to strengthen and support and connect community centers and build a thriving network that creates really healthy and vibrant communities throughout the country. And as I said, we have about 280 centers in about 49 states. So ActionLink came about in 2017. We had community centers that were very concerned, as well as other nonprofits, about not having a voice for the community centers in the policy and advocacy world. So ActionLink, the Center Action Network, is a partnership between CenterLink, between LGBT community centers and other LGBTQ-friendly organizations. And together we navigate through 501c3 policy advocacy issues. And these can be at local, state, and at national levels. And so I just wanted to add this in for any of you that are working for a nonprofit. Why should you advocate? A lot of people will say, I can't do policy and advocacy work as a nonprofit. And so I'm here to say that you absolutely can do that kind of work. And you should advocate because it helps your nonprofit, first of all, meet its mission. It illuminates your community's needs. So by advocating for your community, you can bring attention to a specific issue or problem that allows your policymakers to really see that problem and then address it. It also lowers barriers to broaden access to really important issues, and it can prevent a loss of resources and perhaps helps something that would possibly slash funding. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the type of advocacy things that we do. We do things like create sign-on letters for lawmakers. We do 501c3 lobby training. We help individuals share their stories. So we help them craft a story, and that can be so they can go in and talk to their lawmakers to make the biggest impact. It can be so they can write op-eds for their local newspapers, things like that. We send action alerts out to certain email lists. We provide comments to the Federal Registry. We help our centers plan rallies and town halls. We do virtual and in-person visits with lawmakers. We do things like voter registration days, and we monitor both state and local and federal legislation. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the examples that these small or rural LGBT centers across the country are doing. And I wanted to start with West Virginia, who is doing advocacy trainings. They held this both in person and online due to COVID concerns, and they reviewed both state and federal bills, which is something that I think Representative Boschee is going to do for you tonight. And they trained attendees on how to make calls to their legislators and how to write postcards in support of LGBT-friendly legislation. Then we have a center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who works with us on sharing information about open enrollment for the healthcare marketplace and Medicaid via social media, via radio advertising in their area, putting flyers in their, they have a weekly food bank. So they were putting flyers in the bag for their weekly food bank. They also hold yearly voter registration drives. And they also participate in advocacy around the Equality Act and federal non-discrimination protections. We have in California 23 different LGBT community centers who have come together to form their own statewide coalition. And what they do is they have quarterly meetings, and the larger centers will support and mentor the smaller centers there. And one of the things they did most recently at the end of 2001 was they signed on to an amicus brief for the Supreme Court of California in support of trans older adults. And believe it or not, things still happen in California, which is a very liberal state. In this case, we have something going on in our Supreme Court right now where the advocates at nursing homes and residential care facilities are saying that they don't want to call trans people there by their preferred pronouns. So there's a battle going on about that. So our centers all banded together, wrote an amicus brief, which I helped with. We got an attorney involved and submitted that to the Supreme Court. We also have a center in Orfield, Pennsylvania, who worked with us to schedule a call with their Senate office just to get to know them a little bit better and speak to them about the work they do and talk about how federal non-discrimination protections would really benefit their clients in different ways. And we have a small center in Rapid City, South Dakota called LGBTQ Family Connection Center. They collaborated with other state organizations to host a rally for trans youth rights. And this was very recent. This was in January of this year. They're protesting two bad bills in their state, one that's anti-trans youth medical care and another anti-trans youth in sports. And we're going to see a lot of these kind of bills coming up. I'm not sure if your state has any, but we're seeing these come up all over in different states already early in the year. They're coming up in Florida, they're coming up in Ohio, Indiana. So this is something that's going to be ongoing. We have a center in Staunton, Virginia. This is also a very tiny center. They're all volunteer run. They assisted a trans youth and their family with negotiations with their local school board regarding locker room and bathroom usage. The trans student was the only trans student there in the school. They didn't have a bathroom to use. They were actually running to a Starbucks during the day to go use a bathroom. So they helped negotiate with the school saying, hey, this isn't right. We have to fix something. They spoke at the school board meeting. We helped them to plan a rally outside the building in support of this youth. This is something that's also ongoing. Oops, I don't know what I'm doing here with the slides. Okay. The Onslow County LGBT Community Center in Jacksonville, North Carolina, another very small center. Last year, their governor made anti-LGBT remarks. And so what they did was they organized a rally and a candlelight vigil near where the governor would be speaking a few days later. They put this together really quickly. They asked us for some help with the press release, and several lawmakers attended in support of that rally. And the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, this happened actually just yesterday. They published a statement and contacted their elected officials because a group of lawmakers decided yesterday to repeal LGBTQ protections in housing, employment, and public accommodations. And they did this because they won the majority of the town council in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. So this is an ongoing thing. And I think those are the ends of my slide. I'm going to provide my contact information because I unfortunately am not going to be able to stay for the rest of the presentation. I am helping another center in Nebraska do an advocacy presentation tonight, but Ming and Representative Boschee, I think, have my information. I do have time to take a few questions if we have time for that now. Let me stop sharing my screen. But I just wanted to present some examples. These are examples of the great work our centers are doing. Some of these centers really are run by 1 or 2 volunteers. So it's something that is very possible and very necessary in all of these states.
It does for all our communities. And I think, especially in North Dakota, one of the exciting things I think we can have a conversation about is so often these community centers are built in place. And I think we've seen that as a barrier throughout a rural state where we think that, Fargo may have something, or Grand Forks or Minot or Bismarck, but how do we create maybe a virtual community center so that people, regardless of where they live in the state, can connect. And I think we've seen, as we've been to this virtual world in the last 2 years, there's certainly opportunities for that. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, enjoy the rest of your evening as you work with the Nebraskans. I am excited to be here with you all tonight. I know I recognize a number of friendly faces from my North Fargo district, plenty of people from throughout the state that I've gotten to know, and then, of course, a great number of people that I don't think I know, and some new names and faces. So good to be here with you all. Again, my name is Josh Boschee. I have the privilege of representing District 44 in North Fargo in the State House of Representatives. I grew up in Minot, North Dakota. My family all still lives there. I get back there generally for holidays now, and then we have a family cabin in McLean County, east of Minot a little bit. So I get up there every once in a while. But I'm honored to be here to visit with you all about the legislative process. And my hope is to be engaging and empowering and encouraging, but there are certainly going to be some moments of Debbie Downer. And I think many of you on here understand the realization of where we are in the state of North Dakota when it comes to LGBT equality or progressive policy or what have you. Our state has certainly shifted in the last decade of my involvement since I became involved in state policy making. So to give you an idea of the legislature, in North Dakota, first of all, our legislature meets every other year. And so we have elections. So for instance, we have an election coming up November 2022. And then in January of 2023, we'll go into one of our legislative sessions and generally be done by the end of April. The state constitution only allows us to meet for 80 days every 2 years. And so we generally will use that up in that first 4 months. And then we go home for a year and a half as legislators. We still serve on committees that are studying issues and having conversations around a variety of areas, but we do not enact policy. And so while it's a blessing in the fact that we meet every other year and we all get to be citizen legislators, meaning we get to live at home and amongst the people that we represent and serve, that also the downfall is we only have 80 days. That 80 days goes quick. And if there isn't good organizing happening ahead of time, a lot of times it's difficult to be proactive in legislation and oftentimes requires us to be very responsive in being reactive to legislation. So within the legislature, there are 47 legislative districts throughout the state. And within those districts, each district has 1 senator and 2 representatives. And so right now we just finished up the redistricting process. So a legislative district has approximately 16,500 people in it. So North Dakotans are very well represented in the fact that regardless if your district is like mine, where it's about 30 blocks tall by 15 blocks wide, or like District 29 in the center of the state, which is 7 counties that almost goes from the Canadian border down to south of the interstate. there's still 3 people representing every 16,500 people in North Dakota. And I think that provides us opportunities because we as legislators have a responsibility of knowing who we represent. But you as citizens and as constituents have the opportunity to get to know us. And regardless if that's the legislative district you currently live in, or the district you grew up in, or where you have friends or family, North Dakota is one big town with very long roads. And so I think that provides us an opportunity to build relationships with policymakers to make positive change or to stand up against bad bills when we have to. So I'm going to go into my formal presentation, certainly open for questions, and we'll have time at the end. Some of you will see some of these slides that you've seen in other presentations, but my goal is to spend most of the time talking about how can we be better organized over the next year as we prepare for the 2023 legislative session. And then there's a number of slides that I have that will be made available to attendees. I'm not going to go through them, but it gives you the history of legislation related to the LGBT community over the last 15 years or so in the state in 3 main areas, in housing and employment protections, youth safety, and then marriage family recognition, which are kind of the 3 big areas. But I'll certainly be talking about some of those bills and those experiences as I go through my presentation today. So I am going to do the magic sharing of screens. And there we go. So my contact information, which again will be available on the slide after the presentation. You can connect with me on social media and on Twitter specifically is where I get to be a little more snarky. Facebook, you'll find that I'm a little bit more polished. So let's see here. How do I switch my slide, Ming?
I think if you just click on it, sometimes it'll.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so now it might go fast forward. Many of you I know that are on here are in education or work in human services. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is certainly something that you're familiar with, but some of you aren't. And so I always like to, someone who, as I work in policy, we see policymaking is pretty concrete. And for a lot of people, there's a lot of specific processes and things that we do. But I always like to remind folks that when we're talking about policy, when we talk about progress and advancement or standing up against bad bills, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is important to me because it helps me understand that what conversations are we having? And so as a baseline for those of you, what Maslow's hierarchy of needs says is that at the bottom of that pyramid there, if we as humans don't have our physiological needs met, which includes just the basic necessities for life, then concern about safety, the next rung up, or love and belonging isn't as important. And so as we move up and secure different levels of meeting our needs, whether it's as individuals or communities or as a society, we can advance and have greater conversations or address more needs. And so, when we think about the LGBT community and when we're having conversations specifically, about love and belonging, when we have had the conversation, continue to have the conversation about marriage and relationship recognition and recognition of families, we leapfrogged entire conversations around safety, specifically around members of the transgender community or other members of the LGBT community, specifically people of color, whose safety needs weren't necessarily being met. They are impacted by greater levels of bullying and violence, suicide, homicide. And so while certainly it was great to know that we have made progress in recognizing marriage status, because that's important too, but we're now also still having to have a conversation about safety. And one of those specifically is we know that in 20 some states, including North Dakota, we do not have statewide protections for people based on their employment, based on housing, based on healthcare in some areas, credit, and so forth. So I like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, especially as we talk about our community and the priorities that we address. Not only how do we look at this and how do we advance progress, but how do we make sure that everyone in our community and everyone in our society is having their basic needs met as we continue to make progress. So when I think of policymaking, I am a nerd of policy, whether it's at Congress or state or local levels. But there are four main ways that bills or laws become made. And so if you wouldn't mind entering in the chat, what do you think those four different ways of laws becoming passed are? And then I'll certainly review them with you. So go to your chat function. This is an opportunity for everyone to engage. I'm part of the legislative branch, if that gives you a clue as a policymaker. What are three others? Barry said city ordinances, county level. How about this? Lawmakers, voters, Melissa, think executive orders, petitions, voting measures, administrative rules. Good job, Liz. Citizens approaching and making bills, court decisions. Great. You hit the four basic ways. And so, primarily what I'm going to talk about is the legislative branch. Trying to hit enter here through legislative action. So as some of you indicated, a policymaker or a citizen comes to a policymaker and says, this is some legislation we should pass, whether it's related to a budget issue, whether it's related to certain protections, whether it's related to opportunities or taxation, the voting of a body, whether it's your city commission, your park board, legislature, or Congress enacts through a vote of sometimes a majority or a supermajority, depending on the rules of that state or that body. The next is executive action. Someone had said executive orders in the chat box. So this is the authority that may be granted to individual policymakers. So whether it's your mayor, your governor, the president, even agency heads, they might have some authority depending on which jurisdiction they're in, whether it's a certain city, county, state, or U.S. state or U.S. federal agency. So we saw that we often see that the president passes executive actions to allow things and to take things away. Oftentimes that jurisdiction is within the realm of government employees or programs that the government administers. So it may not impact all of society or all of the nation, but it's a jumpstart sometimes to think about. We saw during the Obama administration in which federal employees were protected from non-discrimination regardless of which agency they worked in. And the fact that there are millions of federal employees around the country, it allowed some progress to be made and allowed for the conversation to grow about, why does this person based on working for the federal government or this person who works for Corporation A have protections in their employment, but the neighbors across the street or the minute I leave my workplace, those protections don't come with me. So it's a way to chip away and make progress, or in some cases we see them get taken away. We've seen that in executive action from governors or mayors as it relates to access to restrooms or access to public facilities. And what does that mean in terms of youth athletes or participating in athletics in your community? The third, someone said the courts, so judicial interpretation. Marriage equality, while certainly there were legislatures and city councils and whatnot that passed different levels or reaches of relationship recognition, it wasn't until two key court cases in which the U.S. Supreme Court determined that the recognition of same-sex, same-gender marriage was universal throughout the United States. So regardless of which state or city you lived in, your marriage could be recognized the same as our heterosexual friends and family members' relationships could be. And with that comes certain benefits and responsibilities. And so that's an example of how law becomes made. And finally, as many of you had said, public referendum. So the ability for a voter to bring something to their government, to their peers to vote on something. So it might be a city ordinance, it might be changing your state constitution, or even just passing, and we don't see it as much in a lot of states, but there is the referendum in which a legislature or a city council passes something, but then the voters say, no, that was a bad idea. We want to take away what you just passed. And they do that through a vote of the people. In a state like North Dakota, one thing that I don't think we access much of, but there's certainly conversations happening around right now, is that public referendum. We being a prairie populous state, just over 100 years ago, when the Nonpartisan League took over and merged with the Republicans, the Democrats, and created basically a third party that had short reign in the state, they initiated and made sure that the state constitution allowed for easy access for voters to make laws, to change the constitution, and to hold legislators or policymakers accountable. And so North Dakota is a state which has fairly easy access to put things on the ballot. And I think that's a good thing because it's a way that the public can hold us as legislators accountable. We will be having a conversation in North Dakota over the next 8 months or 9 months going into the election. There is a group of entities, specifically things like the Chamber of Commerce and corporations, big policy lobbyist groups who are saying they want to protect the Constitution. And they want to make sure that if voters change anything, they have to have 60% of approval versus 50%, which, as many of us may know, that is only going to protect the majority and takes away the vote to the minority. So there'll be a lot of conversations around that here in North Dakota, opportunities for groups or individuals like you all to participate one way or the other in there. One thing that I think we need to do a better, I missed a whole slide. Where did it go? How do I go back now? There we go. Sorry about that, guys. So some things that my advice to all of us, specifically within the LGBT community, but this is true for a lot of other community-based entities or, for lack of a better word, progressive organizations, is we have to start doing a better job of playing offense. And I think we did a good job of that in the LGBT community in North Dakota. This last legislative session, 2021, was actually the first time we had to be on major defense when the House bill that was introduced that would have restricted the ability for transgender youth to participate in youth athletics came forward. Prior to that, most of our conversation, specifically around non-discrimination policies, was proactive. While we weren't able to get it passed, we as a community were bringing that forward for the discussion, and it was on our terms. As frustrating as it is, we've had that conversation since 2009 in almost every legislative session, and we didn't introduce it in 2021. While some members of the community had asked me and others to introduce it, part of the reason I said I wasn't going to was because our advocacy groups and us as a community hadn't moved the needle in between the legislative. We hadn't gone and done the work to find new people to support it, to switch the minds or the hearts of legislators who had voted against it before. So it didn't make sense for us to continue to introduce legislation that we weren't doing the work in the year and a half between legislative sessions to do. But we have that opportunity now. As we look and have 10 months to prepare for the next legislative session, the many legislatures, as you're starting to read the news, South Dakota is back in their session, Minnesota's in, Montana is going to go in. Most legislatures meet every year. North Dakota is one of very few where we meet every other year. And again, that's a blessing and a curse. I wish we met more often, but it also provides us an opportunity to get better organized as a community. And so, a couple ways that we can do that is, by playing offense. One of the easiest things that you can do is find out who your lawmakers are. Who is your state legislator? And yes, they may be people who don't vote for the same values as you or wouldn't vote the same way you do. I think it's important for them to get to know you. And I have a good story I like to share at any group I talk about. When I was first elected in 2012, there was a family in my district who reached out to me. And they just said, hey, we want to meet you. You're a new representative. We want to introduce our family to you. And so we met for coffee at Atomic Coffee in downtown Fargo. And, they shared a little bit about who they were, but their main concern and their main value was around homeschool education. And so, I certainly at that point had my opinions on homeschool education versus public education or other forms of education. But it was nice to meet them. And what happened was, throughout my legislative career, there have been different bills that have been of importance to them. And when they reach out, I know who these people are. They are not just an email anymore. They are people who live and work in my neighborhood. And, I see out and about every once in a while. And so it's impacted how I think about those policies. Now, in all honesty, I haven't supported many of the bills that they've asked me to support. But it has allowed for us to have a dialogue around that. It's allowed us to have a conversation, and it's held me accountable as a policymaker not to ignore their requests. It's harder for me to, if I wanted to hit delete on that email or not get back to them for a couple of weeks if I hadn't met them and knew who they were within my community. And so I encourage members of our community, I encourage, anyone who's looking to engage with their legislator, just go meet them. It might be over coffee or a beer or inviting them over for dinner. It might be at the end of a public session that they're speaking at. You just go up and shake their hand and say, my name's Josh Boschee. I live down on 6th Avenue and 1st Street. I just want to introduce myself and let you know that, I pay attention to policy. I'm going to be reaching out to you during session, and I hope we can visit about some of the issues that are important to me. I don't even think you have to tell them you're a member of the LGBT community or that you are an ally to the LGBT community if you don't want to in that first introduction. But when they meet you, then you can introduce yourself again and remind them. Because I will tell you, and I don't know how many of my colleagues are being honest when they say this, but many of them will straight face say into a microphone, there are no gay people in my community. There are no gay people that live in my district. And in some of those cases, I know they're not accurate, but they've not heard from LGBT people or someone hasn't shared with them. And so you and I all know that there certainly are LGBT people in their lives and in their communities, but we have to do a better job of, especially in the off season, is a great time for people to connect with their policymakers. It's, the temperature is down in terms of we're not talking about a specific bill. We're not, there's not friction in terms of fighting yes or no. And I can tell you as a policymaker who's trying to vote on 900 bills in 80 days, there's a lot of information that is thrown at us right before session and during session. And we have to make a lot of decisions. And so if you spend that time ahead of time, in May this year or April this year, getting to know your legislator, it just makes it that much easier when it comes time to talk about the legislation you support or you oppose. And so I encourage you to do that. It's one thing I will task you all with, and in a future slide, I'll give you some resources on how to reach out to your legislator. The next thing we have to do is then organize. We have to do a much better job as the LGBT community of connecting with groups like the North Dakota Human Rights Coalition or local LGBT groups, and not just connect in the standpoint of receiving emails. I think many of you are great at, helping financially support organizations, and that's a step certainly, and it's an important step, but we need leaders. We need some leadership. And leadership isn't always meaning you have to stand at a microphone and speak into it at a legislative hearing. Leadership is also helping us identify people who have similar values in your county or in your district or in your community. Leadership is helping make sure that we are aware of issues that are going on in your community, or helping us connect parents with one another who have an LGBT kid that just came out, and how do they find resources and peers and other parents and so forth. But I can tell you there is a big need for us to do a better job of organizing. And I know North Dakota Human Rights Coalition, in collaboration with some of our national partners, have been doing that over the last year. Many of you have probably had the opportunity to meet Zayden, and I saw Zayden come in on the call, but I'm just so happy that, you know, the work that Barry and NDHRC has done has now allowed us to have a member of our community helping lead, especially in Western North Dakota out of Bismarck. So Zayden, appreciate you stepping up and being a part of our progress. You know, as I said before, with those 4 different levels of how policy becomes law in a state like North Dakota, it's very accessible. And you know, again, 16,500 people is who we all represent. So it gives you an opportunity to get to know your legislator, but it also allows us the opportunity to organize and get to know things on the grassroots level. And so I like the idea, you know, as I said goodbye and thank you to Tanya about, you know, maybe we need to stop thinking as much about our physical communities and where we live as LGBT members, but how do we work as a statewide network to build a community center, if it's virtually, or making sure that, you know, the successes that are happening in Williston are being told in Fargo, and Fargo sharing its resources with Harvey and so forth. So I think we have to figure out, and I think that's a good conversation after this conference for folks that are interested in what does that look like. Ming, you had your hand up.
No, I was just applauding Zayden.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you. Thanks. The next thing is we really have to think about our message. You know, some of the reason we saw winning arguments in legislatures throughout the country, specifically around marriage equality and relationship recognition, was there was a shift in how we talked about it. And, you know, that certainly becomes the politicianary thing of it, or the political aspect of it, because it becomes poll tested and you figure it out. But a lot of times we want to talk about fairness, and it certainly is about fairness when it comes to the fact that people are trying to take away opportunities from LGBT youth, or not recognizing relationships that also come with benefits that include healthcare and adoption and things like that. But in a state like North Dakota, fairness doesn't resonate with the majority of my colleagues. And that's regardless of political party. But if we start talking about individual freedoms and the rights and the abilities and families, those are more shared values that we can talk about with policymakers who may not be with us initially, or are unsure what they support or don't support within the LGBT community. But figuring out how we talk about not only the things that we're supporting, but the legislation that that we have opposed and we have to prepare to oppose in this next legislative session. And so when we talk about that message, it's also not just during the legislative session, but how are we increasing our visibility throughout the state, again, in the off season? How are we responding to letters to the editor, or making sure that we're raising our hand and saying, you know what, I'm willing to speak to the media locally if there's questions about issues. You know, I know that's a difficult task to ask some people, but if that's an area of training or learning that you want to have, I think those are opportunities that, again, groups like NDHRC, along with our partners, we can facilitate to identify how do we make sure that there's more people speaking. I know many of you have seen me on TV or know that I've spoken publicly about our community, and I'm so proud to represent our community. But I also know that I'm one person, and there's hundreds, if not thousands of you out there who can also speak on behalf of our community. And we need to diversify that, because honestly, within policymaking, people will get tired of hearing from me. I know there are members in our community who are tired of hearing, oh, there's Josh up at the microphone again. And I recognize that. So it would be nice to make sure that we have people of different genders, of different relationships, of different races and ethnicities that represent our community, different abilities, so that we are as diverse as the rest of the community, and we're representing that when we're talking throughout our state in our local communities. And finally, I think the most important part about organizing, and this is where, not only we drop the ball, but a lot of other groups, because we are so focused trying to work on the issues in front of us and what's important to us, but collaborating with organizations that are supportive of us, organizations that are similarly valued. And so that means showing up. When we ask people to show up at Pride events or Pride rallies or to stand up at the Capitol to fight back against discrimination, that when we ask organized labor or Planned Parenthood or the Women's Network or even the Chamber of Commerce or corporations in our community to step forward and support us, we need to find those times when we have shared values with the issues they're facing and show up and reciprocate. I know that is one thing that I do hear from some of our partner and ally organizations, is that they're certainly able and willing to show up for us, but they don't necessarily see it reciprocated. So I think for us to figure out how do we build a bigger table where more voices are around there and we're a part of that table, but how do we make sure we're supporting the work that's happening in those organizations that are also supporting us? And that's informally, but also building formal coalitions. Some of you are familiar with an organization that's been growing over the last year called the North Dakota or Alliance for Better North Dakota. And they have a different organizations within there, but they are a group that is just that. They are progressive organizations that value LGBT inclusivity and equality, and they are working on behalf of us, but also helping provide support to organizations like NDHRC and the Pride Collective, Women's Network, a number of others around, whether it's media training, whether it's connecting and making sure that folks are understanding the different things that are happening in different organizations or issues that are important. So some of that work's already started and it's great, and you can tap into that. We'd invite you to that table. So progress, as my title says, is not a spectator sport. And I recognize that advocacy and policymaking and some of this work is very tiring, especially when you feel like, I got to get up and go to work. I have to pay the bills. I have to take care of my family. I have to make sure that my yard is shoveled and my yard is mowed. I have to make sure that there's food on the table for my family. But the challenge we're having is that we are coming in. We have pivoted as a state legislature in our level of conservatism to where we are going to spend a lot of time having to be on defense, especially this next session. And I hate to be that Debbie Downer, but that's the reality. And we got a taste of it in 2021 during the session. Thankfully, we were able to get people rallied and push back against the anti-trans youth bill. But the reality of that is if the governor hadn't vetoed it, that bill would be law in North Dakota. And it would have been a huge impact not only to LGBT youth, but also our economies throughout the state, because the unintended consequences were that there were groups that wouldn't come to a state, swimming organizations, wrestling organizations, many that come in and compete or host their events in North Dakota wouldn't come here because they wouldn't have been able to be in compliance because of their own policies of allowing all students to participate in their athletic sport. But, we were able to sustain his veto in the Senate, and that was just by a margin of 3 votes. And unfortunately, I can tell you 3 of those votes have already announced that they've retired from the Senate. And so we don't only have to prepare and work for the policy side, but also how do we make sure that we are electing legislators, regardless of political party, that are going to make reasonable votes as it relates to making sure that North Dakota is a state where all of us can be successful, where all of us have an opportunity, and we aren't continuing to create this division of the straight community versus the LGBT community or Black community against the non-Black community. We have to make sure that we get reasonable legislators elected, again, regardless of political party. And because there are bills that are going to be coming. It was talked about at the end of 2021, especially related to trans North Dakotans and even more so trans youth. And so there's work to be done. And I think we can do it. We have the 10 months to do it. We have the people who have the skill set. And I'm just excited to be able to be in solidarity with so many of you about that. I like this visual. It's one that many of you have probably seen before, but it's the idea that, you know, when the big bad shark is coming after us and they pick us off one by one, you know, divide and conquer is a real strategy, whether it's intentional or not. But we can be intentional in our organizing of building power through people. As a legislator, you know, a lot of people provide a lot of reverence to me in my title and in my position. But I often remind people I put on my pants the same way as everyone else. The only power I have is the power you give me. And a lot of times that power is given to legislators because we don't show up or we don't hold them accountable. And so what I like about this visual is, again, when we band together, when there's many of us small fish working together, we're able to organize against the big bad powers that be that want to not provide us opportunity or take away the rights and things that we fought hard for. So keep that in mind, especially as I look and we have 32 people on a cold winter night here in North Dakota. Maybe that helped that it was cold and it's not July that we're having this summit, but I know there's interest in this conversation and the ability for us to move our community forward. My challenge to you all, you know, based off of what we talked about in terms of how laws become enacted or how we push back against bad laws, in the work that we need to do to make progress, is these are some really simple things that you can do simply over the next 30 days. As I talked about, contact your legislators, introduce yourself, ask them where they stand on issues. And, you know, and again, it doesn't have to be in your first conversation. Your first conversation could and should be just a genuine introduction. I'm introducing myself because I live in your district. The work you do is important, and I want to be a part of making sure that you know, you're informed on issues that are important to me. And then it could be that second or third time is when you actually start talking about the issues that are of value to you. Again, because we are such a small state, I know that there are legislators that, because of the last person who talks to them before they vote, is going to change how they vote. And so our key in our organizing is trying to make sure that if you're one of those people who have talked to your legislator and they know they have to come home and they're going to see you at church or they're going to see you at work or they're going to see you in the community, that holds a lot of weight. And unfortunately, you know, the ultra conservative, the ultra faction of people who are anti-equality right now have that power over policymakers, that fear. And I think we can embrace that and take it back in terms of not only showing them support of how we will take care of them and when they do the right thing, but also hold them accountable when they make the wrong decisions or they pass policy that's harmful to young people and to North Dakotans throughout the state. We're going into election season. Over half the legislative seats are going to be up because of redistricting. As a little refresher, in North Dakota, presidential years, even number districts run. So if you're in District 2 or 44 or 46 or 30, your legislators run during presidential elections. Odd number districts run in a midterm election. So 2022 is a midterm election. That is when all of the odd number districts and a few districts, including my own, are up as even number districts because of some of the boundaries that have changed for redistricting. So candidates come knock on your door. Don't hide in the basement. Don't sit at the kitchen table and just ignore them. It's an opportunity. They're coming to ask you at your home to vote for them. It's a great way for you to bring up an opportunity in it to talk about issues that are important to you, whether it's childcare, whether it's elder care, whether it's public school education, the LGBT community, criminal justice reform. You know, the absence of us talking about these issues creates a void and a vacuum and an opportunity for policymakers to say, well, no one's talked to me about that, or no one that I know thinks that's an important issue. Third is vote, which, you know, I have a good feeling that everyone on this call, if not the majority of you, probably are active, engaged voters, but then it's a matter of trying to find 5 other people to vote with you. You know, fortunately in North Dakota, absent the voter ID limitation or the requirement to have a voter ID to vote, we have pretty accessible voting, especially with our early vote options, our abilities to vote by mail. My favorite thing to do, especially with sometime voters or people that, are only voting on one issue. So if that issue is not up, or a candidate that doesn't value that issue isn't up, is to get them to vote by mail. You fill out an application with them, they sign it, you mail it into your county auditor, and up to 60 days or 40 days before the election, they'll be mailed a ballot. And then the next time you're over having a beer with them or a picnic or coffee, you can sit down and help them vote from the comfort of their own home. On election day, I have a ton of friends who love to be able to go vote with me, but the only person that actually gets to vote with me is the person who goes at 7:30 in the morning. But there usually are about 10 other people that I schedule to go vote with, and I'll pick them up and take them to vote, and then wait for them to vote. But at least I make sure that they're getting there to vote. And that's an opportunity for you too on election day, or with all the early voting opportunities throughout our communities to do. You will be surprised at the number of people who don't vote that might tell you they vote. So this is a way for you to help hold them accountable or introduce them to how easy voting can be, because it's an intimidating process. A lot of people, especially as we're having dialogue nationally and locally about elections being stolen and the process being rigged, there's a lot of people who just don't think the system is going to work for them. And so we have a lot of work to do to make sure that folks have confidence. And I can tell you in North Dakota, we do have a really good system. And that's because our systems are run at the county level. Our auditors are generally professional people. Very few of them, if any, are partisan. Many of them aren't elected anymore. They are hired. So they are the epitome of a bureaucrat, because they are people who like to process things and to have good processes in place. So it provides us to have good and opportunities to have for folks to vote and engage in the process. So that's, my canned presentation for the most part. Like I said, I have several slides that you all will get that'll talk about some of the history of policy and legislation in the state. But I'd love to hear from you. What questions do you have? What thoughts do you have? I mean, there's plenty of people on this call who have their own experience in being advocates. And as you think about your questions, I'm just pulling up the chat box here, and I'll start going through some of these.